February 27, 1943. Vemork, Norway. Temperature, -15 degrees Celsius. 9 Norwegian commandos crept through the frozen darkness toward a fortress built into the side of a cliff. Inside, Nazi Germany was producing the one substance that could give Hitler atomic weapons: heavy water. The facility was considered impregnable, surrounded by minefields, guarded by German troops, positioned at the edge of a 600-foot gorge. Allied intelligence called it the most important industrial target in occupied Europe. Joachim Ronneberg, 23 years old, led the sabotage team. Their mission: destroy the heavy water production before Nazi scientists could use it to build a nuclear reactor and, ultimately, an atomic bomb. They had no backup. No escape plan if caught. Just explosives, silence, and the knowledge that if they failed, Hitler might win the race to nuclear weapons. One commando later wrote, "We knew we were probably going to our deaths. But we also knew what would happen if we didn't try." This is the story of Operation Gunnerside, the raid that saved the world from Hitler's atomic ambitions. To understand why 9 men risked everything on a Norwegian mountainside, we need to understand what heavy water is and why Nazi Germany needed it desperately. Heavy water, or deuterium oxide, is chemically similar to ordinary water but contains deuterium atoms instead of normal hydrogen. In 1943, it was the only known substance that could moderate nuclear reactions in an atomic reactor. Germany's top scientists, led by Werner Heisenberg, were attempting to build a nuclear reactor as the first step toward atomic weapons. They needed tons of heavy water. Only one facility in the world could produce it in industrial quantities: Norsk Hydro's plant at Vemork, Norway, now under German control. By 1943, Allied intelligence confirmed Germany had stockpiled approximately 1,500 kilograms of heavy water at Vemork. Scientists calculated that amount could allow construction of a functioning nuclear reactor within months. Winston Churchill received the intelligence reports and made a stark assessment: this target must be destroyed at all costs. The Americans agreed. The Vemork plant had become the most critical sabotage objective of the war. But how do you destroy a facility built into solid rock, guarded by Wehrmacht troops, surrounded by a frozen wilderness, and accessible only by a single bridge that Germans monitored constantly? The British had already tried once and failed catastrophically. In November 1942, Operation Freshman attempted to insert 2 gliders carrying 34 British Royal Engineers to sabotage Vemork. Both gliders crashed in the Norwegian mountains during a storm. 17 men died in the crashes. The survivors were captured by the Gestapo. Under Hitler's commando order, which declared captured commandos were not prisoners of war but terrorists, all survivors were executed. The mission accomplished nothing except alerting the Germans that the Allies considered Vemork a priority target. German security at the facility tripled. Minefields were expanded. Guard patrols increased. The single bridge became a fortress. A second attempt would face even greater obstacles, but failure was not an option. The Norwegian government in exile in London and the British Special Operations Executive devised a new plan. Instead of a large British force, they would send a small team of Norwegian commandos, men who spoke the language, knew the terrain, and could blend into the population if necessary. The operation was codenamed Gunnerside, and it would be led by Lieutenant Joachim Ronneberg of the Norwegian Independent Company 1. Joachim Ronneberg was not a professional soldier. Born in 1919 in Alesund, Norway, He was a 20-year-old fisherman when Germany invaded Norway in April 1940. He escaped to Britain and volunteered for the Norwegian Independent Company, an elite unit trained by the British SOE for special operations. His training was brutal: explosives, silent killing, winter survival, lockpicking, long-range navigation. The SOE instructors noted he possessed exceptional leadership qualities: calm under pressure, methodical planning, absolute reliability. For Operation Gunnerside, Ronneberg selected 8 men: Knut Håkelid, Frederick Kaiser, Kasper Idland, Hans Storhaug, Birger Stromsheim, Leif Larsen, and 2 others. Each had intimate knowledge of Norwegian terrain and winter survival. They would parachute into Norway, link up with an advance reconnaissance team already in position, cross 100 miles of frozen wilderness, infiltrate the Vemork facility, place explosives on the heavy water production cells, and escape across the mountains to Sweden. British planners estimated their survival chances at 50%, and that was optimistic. Ronneberg studied reconnaissance photographs and intelligence reports obsessively. The facility had multiple defensive layers: minefields, floodlit perimeter, guard patrols, and the gorge itself a 600-foot drop with only one accessible bridge. But Ronneberg identified a vulnerability. A railway line ran along the gorge bottom. If they could descend the cliff face, cross the frozen river, and climb up the other side, they could approach from a direction the Germans considered impossible. February 16, 1943. 4 Halifax bombers dropped the Gunnerside team over the Norwegian mountains. They landed scattered across miles of frozen wilderness in a blizzard. It took 2 days to reassemble the team and recover supply containers. Then they began the approach march. The advance reconnaissance team, Operation Swallow, for men who'd been living in the mountains since October, provided critical intelligence. They confirmed the guards' routines, identified blind spots in the security, and located the heavy water production cells within the facility. The combined team established a base camp 10 miles from Vemork and waited for the right conditions. For 11 days, they watched the facility, studying patterns, memorizing guard changes, identifying the weakest approach route. Temperature dropped to -30 degrees. They lived in snow caves, rationing food, unable to light fires that might reveal their position. One team member developed frostbite. Another caught pneumonia. But Ronneberg refused to rush the operation. He would attack only when conditions were perfect. On February 27, the moment came. Moon phase, waning crescent, providing darkness for infiltration. Weather, clear and cold, minimizing sound travel. Guards, following predictable routine. Ronneberg gathered his team and gave final instructions. They would move at 2000 hours, 8 in the evening. Target time at the facility, midnight. The descent into the gorge was the first test. In darkness, wearing white camouflage over their combat gear, the 9 commandos climbed down a near-vertical cliff face. Ice-covered rock. 600 feet of exposure. One slip meant death. They used climbing ropes and moved in complete silence. Any noise would echo across the valley to German listening posts. It took 90 minutes to reach the bottom. At the base of the gorge, the Mana River was partially frozen. They crossed on ice, then faced the second climb up the opposite cliff to the facility. By 23:30 hours, they were at the perimeter. The Germans had cut down all trees for 300 meters around the facility, creating a killing zone illuminated by floodlights. But Ronneberg's intelligence was correct: there was a blind spot. A steep gully on the northeast approach, considered too difficult to climb, was unguarded and outside the floodlit zone. The team crawled through the gully, emerging at the facility's basement level exactly where the heavy water production cells were located. They reached the entrance, a heavy steel door, locked. This was another critical moment. If they had to blast the door, the explosion would alert the guards and turn the mission into a firefight they couldn't win. Ronneberg sent forward Frederick Kaiser, the team's lock-picking specialist. Kaiser worked on the lock for 8 minutes, an eternity when German guards patrolled overhead. Finally, the lock clicked open. The team entered. Inside, the facility was warm, industrial, humming with machinery. They moved through corridors, following the layout memorized from reconnaissance photographs. Then they heard voices, Norwegian voices. 2 Norwegian workers were on night shift in the heavy water production room. Ronneberg faced a decision. Kill them to preserve secrecy? Take them prisoner? Or trust them? He chose trust. Approaching the workers calmly, Ronneberg spoke in Norwegian. "We're from the Norwegian army in Britain. We're here to destroy the heavy water. Don't be alarmed. You won't be harmed." The workers, initially terrified, realized what was happening and smiled. One later recalled, "I wanted to cheer. We'd been waiting for this." They showed Ronneberg exactly which cells contained the highest concentration of heavy water and explained the facility's layout. 5 minutes saved by their cooperation might mean the difference between escape and capture. The sabotage team worked with precision. They placed 18 demolition charges around the heavy water cells, enough to destroy the equipment and spill the entire stockpile, but calculated to avoid structural damage that might harm the Norwegian workers or cause unnecessary casualties. Ronneberg set the fuses for 30 seconds, time enough to evacuate the building but not enough for German guards to intervene if they heard the entry. At 0045 hours on February 28, the team withdrew. They retraced their route through the corridors, exited through the steel door they'd picked, and began running toward the gorge. Behind them, seconds ticked down. The explosion, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. A muffled boom, the charges had been placed to direct the blast force inward, minimizing external noise. Inside the production room, all 18 cells shattered. 3,000 liters of heavy water poured across the floor and drained away into the facility's wastewater system. Germany's entire stockpile gone in seconds. The alarm sounded immediately. German guards rushed to the facility, expecting to find a large raiding force. Instead, they found empty corridors, broken equipment, and confused Norwegian workers who claimed they'd seen nothing. By the time the Germans organized pursuit, Ronneberg's team had vanished into the Norwegian mountains. The escape was as dangerous as the raid. For the next 2 weeks, the 9 commandos split into smaller groups and crossed 400 kilometers of winter wilderness, hunted by German patrols, Gestapo agents, and collaborators. They traveled on skis, mostly at night, avoiding settlements, surviving on emergency rations and what they could forage. 5 of Ronneberg's team, including Ronneberg himself, reached Sweden safely after 15 days. The others went into hiding in Norway, joining resistance networks. Not a single commando was captured. The Germans conducted massive reprisals, arresting suspected collaborators, executing hostages, intensifying occupation brutality, but the Gunnerside team had disappeared like ghosts. In Germany, the news reached Werner Heisenberg and the nuclear research team. The loss of the heavy water was catastrophic. It would take months to rebuild the production capacity. Even then, they would face the same vulnerability. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, authorized reconstruction of the Vemork facility. By November 1943, production had resumed, and a new stockpile of heavy water was accumulating. Allied intelligence detected this immediately. If sabotage worked once, it could work again, but this time, the Germans were prepared. The Allies made a brutal calculation. Rather than risk another commando raid, they would destroy Vemork from the air. On November 16, 1943, 143 American B-17 Flying Fortresses bombed the facility in broad daylight. The raid caused extensive damage but missed the heavy water production cells. It did accomplish one thing, convincing the Germans that Vemork was too vulnerable. They decided to evacuate the remaining heavy water stockpile to Germany. February 1944. German engineers loaded the remaining heavy water, approximately 600 kilograms, onto railway cars for transport to Germany. The route required crossing Lake Tinn on the ferry Hydro. Norwegian resistance discovered the plan. Knut Haukelid, one of the original Gunnerside commandos still operating in Norway, was given a desperate mission: sink the ferry before it could deliver the heavy water to Germany. The moral calculation was agonizing. The ferry carried civilian passengers, Norwegian men, women, and children going about their daily lives. Sinking it would result in civilian casualties. But if the heavy water reached Germany, Nazi atomic research might succeed, potentially resulting in millions of casualties. Haukelid made the decision. On the night of February 19, he and two other resistance members boarded the Hydro and placed explosive charges in the bilge, timed to detonate when the ferry reached the deepest part of Lake Tinn. At 1000 hours on February 20, 1944, the charges exploded. The Hydro sank in minutes. 14 Norwegian civilians perished along with 4 German soldiers. The heavy water, Germany's last significant stockpile, went to the bottom of a Norwegian lake. Haukelid wrote in his memoir, "It was the hardest decision I ever made. We weighed 14 lives against potentially millions. It was still murder. It was also necessary." The strategic consequences were decisive. After losing Vemork's production capability and the heavy water stockpile, German atomic research effectively stopped. Werner Heisenberg's team attempted to continue using alternative methods, but without industrial quantities of heavy water, they couldn't construct a functioning nuclear reactor. Post-war interrogations of German scientists revealed they were still years away from atomic weapons when the war ended. The Allies' efforts, through sabotage and bombing, had prevented Hitler from acquiring the technology that would have changed history. But the human cost was significant. The Gunnerside raid itself succeeded with 0 casualties, a military miracle. The subsequent bombing and ferry sabotage resulted in civilian casualties that haunt historians and participants to this day. Knut Haukelid struggled with guilt over the Hydro sinking for the rest of his life, even as he acknowledged its necessity. This moral complexity defines resistance warfare. Unlike conventional military operations with uniformed combatants fighting on battlefields, resistance operations occur in civilian populations, involve terrible choices, and blur lines between combatant and civilian. The Vemork operations exemplify both the courage and the moral burden of resistance fighters who operated in occupied territory with impossible decisions and catastrophic stakes. Joachim Ronneberg survived the war. He returned to Norway, married, and worked as a radio station manager, refusing to discuss his wartime exploits for decades. Only in his later years did he speak publicly about Operation Gunnerside, and always with humility. Asked if he felt like a hero, he responded, "We were just Norwegian soldiers doing our duty." The real heroes were the resistance members who stayed in occupied Norway every day, risking their lives constantly. "We had one dangerous night." He passed away in 2018 at age 99, the last surviving member of the Gunnerside team. The Vemork facility still stands, now converted into the Norwegian Industrial Workers Museum. Visitors can walk through the basement where Ronneberg's team placed their charges, see the rebuilt heavy water cells, and stand where 9 men changed the course of history. The museum doesn't glorify the operation. Instead, it presents the complexity, the courage required, the moral calculations involved, the civilian suffering that resulted, and the historical necessity that drove those decisions. In the broader narrative of World War II, the Vemork sabotage represents a critical inflection point. Had Hitler acquired atomic weapons, the war's outcome and subsequent history would have been catastrophically different. 9 Norwegian commandos, operating with precision and courage, prevented that nightmare. But they also remind us that even necessary acts of war carry moral weight, and that true heroism often involves impossible choices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Their story deserves to be remembered, not as simple heroism, but as the complex, difficult reality of resistance warfare where victory came at a cost, and where courage meant accepting moral burdens that lasted a lifetime.